Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. Tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to continue with the transatlantic slave trade and our look into slavery in America. However, today I'm going to present you with the actual research that I have done. And the reason why I want to show you this research that I have done is because I find it fascinating, and I'm sure that you will too, to actually look at the written documents of the time period. And other than the remarkable and the fascinating argument that this abolitionist, Anthony Benezet, gives against slavery, look at how the English language was written back then. I remember a few months ago when I was looking into this, I sent some excerpts to a friend of mine, and he sent an email back saying, well, why are they writing their S's like F's? And I just told him that's how they used to write back then. So when you do research and you start digging back into history, sometimes it costs a lot to read these documents because they might not be written the way that you're used to seeing things written, and they're not written in the same English language that you're used to reading every day. So this is what goes into research, but this is particularly why I like to look at original documents that have been made digital. In this particular piece that I picked, I really like the research and the way that you can continue to research, because this is a document that was put together by several documents, and we'll see that when we get into it, because I've made excerpts of this 56-page document. We're not going to read all 56 pages, but you will have documentation so you can find it yourself and read the whole 56 pages by yourself. But let's just get into it. Okay, with this first slide, this is a nice source to get original material. Many times people will want to do research and they just say Google this and Google that and look on the internet. Well, there are certain databases that you can look at that have original documents that you can look at, which I call real research. So this is America's Historical Imprints. So you pull up that database. If you're in college, you can get it through the college database. You may have to pay for it if you're not in college, but if you're in college, you're paying for it anyway. And you may have access to it at your library. Okay, so we go into subjects, and then when you go through the subjects, you look down and you see slave trade. So you go to slave trade, and then you click on slave trade, and then that will take you to a slide that looks like this. And then you can just have at it. Now, the one thing about research is you have a certain goal or a certain agenda that you're trying to accomplish, and you'll find out that the majority of your time is spent reading material that doesn't have anything to do with your agenda. But that's not wasted time. That's just time that you won't have to spend later when you actually do find what it is you're looking for. I remember one evening in school, I was doing a paper and I spent 10 hours looking for certain material to support my thesis. I spent 10 hours in one day and didn't find anything at all And I told my friend, like, I wasted 10 hours looking for something I couldn't find. He said it wasn't a waste of time. He said that's just time that you spent knowing that you won't have to look in those particular areas again. So let's get into this document. Okay, a short account of that part of Africa inhabited by the Negroes, with respect to the fertility of the country, the good disposition of many of the natives, and the manner by which the slave trade is carried on. Extracted from several authors in order to show the iniquity of that trade and the falsity of the arguments usually advanced in its vindication, with a quotation from George Wallace's System of Laws and a large extract from a pamphlet lately published in London on the subject of the slave trade. So, in this document, it has examples extracted from several authors in order to show the iniquity of that trade. So when you're doing research and you see that it is information extracted from several authors, what you want to do when you go through this research is you want to take note of each one of those authors, and when you're done reading this document, you want to look up each one of those authors to see what they wrote about the slave trade. Now, of course, I'm not going to do that here on this video because we will be here for several hours, but that's what you would like to do when you're researching a subject like the transatlantic slave trade. Now, many people like to argue that the victors are those who wrote the history. So when we read in this document sections where they talk about the Africans actually trading their own people, you have to understand this entire paper, and many of the papers where you do find truths are in those papers of those who are trying to refute and trying to stop a certain trade. Now, this Anthony Benezet, he was an abolitionist, so he was against the slave trade. So he's making arguments against the slave trade. And as we've done in previous videos of mine, as we've read literature and we've read history where certain arguments that people say now in 2018 were the same arguments that people were putting forth way back in the 1700s when this paper was written. And you're going to see the same arguments against the slave trade. You know, when you tell someone you were capturing slaves, or when you tell people, well, the slave trade was wrong, they turn around and say, well, Africans were selling the slaves. Well, those same arguments were given in this paper, and Anthony rebukes that argument as well, as we'll see as we continue. Okay, extracted from several authors in order to show the iniquity of that trade and the falsity of the arguments usually advanced in this vindication. I just highlighted that to show that this is extracted from several authors. And again, if you want to look further into the slave trade, you should get this document, take notes of those authors, which I didn't document every author either because I expect you to go to do the research on your own, and I gave you the database that you can look at, but I would go and find those authors and see what they had to do or what they had to say about the slave trade. And again, here, this is a religious part. There's a lot of religious writing in the writings of the abolitionists and of early America, because America was settled by the Puritans. So in most of our laws and many values that America claims to have are based in religion, whether you're religious or not. And many arguments in support of slavery, people say come from Christianity, and they try to say, well, that's the white man's religion. But in this document, and if you do more research, you will see that these abolitionists, and for example, even if you study the slave revolts of like Nat Turner and of John Brown, you'll see that the readings from the Bible uh, gave them power to rise up against slavery and show that slavery was wrong. And here is a quote from the Bible: God that hath made the world hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bonds of their habitation. The people of the land oppression, and exercised robbery, and have vexed the poor and needy, yet they have oppressed the stranger wrongfully. Now, I should have looked up this verse before doing this paper, because I can't. The land have, I don't know what that word is before oppression, but the point is they have oppressed the stranger wrongfully. And what they're referring to in this is that the Europeans and the colonies are in the slave trade and oppressing the stranger wrongfully. And the stranger in this quote, and what they're using it for, is to say that the African is the stranger because he does not belong in the slave trade being brought to America to be oppressed. It is a truth as sorrowful as obvious that mankind too generally are actuated by false motives and substitute an imaginary interest in the room of that which is real and permanent. And it must be acknowledged by every man who is sincerely desirous of becoming acquainted with himself and impartially inspects his own heart that weakens and inbred corruption attends human that weakness and inbred corruption attends human nature, which cannot. See, what I get from this is the part where it says that it is a truth as sorrowful as obvious that mankind too generally are actuated by false motives and substitute an imaginary interest in the room of that which is real and permanent. See, people like to cover up what they do that they know is wrong and then spread false information. This is why we have to create our own narrative, because they do false motives and substitute an imaginary interest in the room of that which is real and permanent. And this is where he's setting up, he spends, Anthony, the author, he spends a few pages setting up his argument before he gets into the actual observations which are documented in this paper of what is going on in Africa and the slave trade. And bloodshed continually fomented in those unhappy people's country, the Africans. It is also intended to invalidate some false arguments. So he's talking about what the purpose of this paper. It is also intended to invalidate some false arguments which are frequently advanced for the palliation thereof, in hopes it may be some inducement to those who are not defiled with this trade to keep themselves clear, and to lay before such as have unwarily engaged in it the danger they are in of totally losing that tender sensibility to the sufferings of their fellow creatures, the want whereof sets men beneath the brute creation, which must unavoidably be the state of everyone that continues to partake of the profits arising from this wicked traffic, a trade by which so many thousands of innocent people are brought under the greatest anxiety and suffering, being violently rent from their native country in the most cruel manner and brought to our colonies to be employed in hard labor. See, that right there talks about a trade being taking place and stealing. So when the arguments come up that some Africans were trading Africans, and then you argue back that no, they were stolen, both of it was happening on a grand scale. Many were being sold by the hundreds, and many were being captured by the hundreds, and even when thousands were dying. But when you start doing your research and you start reading through these documents, you'll see that. So, and this also talks about, like, he's writing this to invalidate some false arguments which are frequently advanced. And those false arguments were being advanced back in the 1700s, and they're still being advanced now. Why? That's due to complete ignorance. The false arguments that I just talked about. So they talk about when people do talk about Africans being sold and Africans being captured, they still don't know the motives and the workings behind what was going on to make all of that possible. And that's where the false arguments, ignorant arguments, actually come in. So that's why we're doing this research. Either in northern climates, unsuited to their nature, or in a state of the most tyrannic and barbarous slavery, subject to the humors and inhumane last of some of the most hard-hearted and inconsiderate of mankind, without any hopes of ever returning to their native land or seeing an end to their misery. Nor must we omit in the dismal account the weight of blood which lies on the promoters of this trade, from the great numbers that are yearly butchered in the incursions and battles which happen between the Negroes in order to procure the number delivered to the Europeans, and many of these who perish through misery and grief on the passage. Heaven preserve the inhabitants of Pennsylvania from being further defiled by a trade which is entered upon from such sensual motives and carried on by such devilish means. So, in the northern climates, unsuited to their nature, in the U.S., we like to imagine that slavery only happened in the South. During the slave trade has been going on in the U.S. since the Puritans, before there even was a North and a South. So we don't even need to argue that. In this section, he's talking about, he said, the northern climates, which he means the colonies, unsuited to their nature. And then he gets into the promoters of this trade, the Europeans, from the great numbers that are yearly butchered in the incursions and battles which happen between the Negroes in order to procure the number delivered to the Europeans, and many of these who perished through misery and grief on the passage. So he talks about the Europeans being behind the battles, the divide and conquer tactics that they used in Africa to get the Africans to fight each other, take each other as prisoners, capture each other, and to sell them into slavery, which in this document he goes more into depth about how that happens, and I have some excerpts about that. And then he talks about the passage, many who perished through misery and grief on the passage. That's the middle passage that he's talking about, where millions actually died on the middle passage. And heaven preserved the inhabitants of Pennsylvania. So he's like, Pennsylvania used to be where the capital of the center of the colonies, and where all the current, like, Washington D.C. was in Pennsylvania back then. And although these scenes of horror are acted in places far remote and out of the sight of those who are the most enriched thereby, whose senses being usually exercised only by present objects are little affected with the distant sufferings of their fellow creatures. Yet every mind which is not hardened with the love of wealth as to be void of feeling must, upon serious consideration of this inhuman practice, be impressed with surprise and terror from a sense that there is a righteous God, and a state of retribution which must last forever. See, this is very interesting right here, where he says those scenes of horror, slavery, acted out in places far remote and out of the sight of those who are the most enriched. So those who are making the most money out of the slave trade were not those who were actually carrying out the heinous acts and coups. You know, they would finance it and then make money off of it, which happens today, and you don't see it. Like, when we talk about the horrors and stuff that go on in the prisons system, and we hear all kind of stories of people dying, people getting killed, people getting raped, and all of that stuff going on in the prison systems, we don't see it. It's out of sight, and the prison system makes billions and billions of dollars every year. And the guards in there and the actual prisoners in there aren't the ones making the billions and billion dollars of profit. So during slavery, those who were making the most profit weren't the ones actually carrying out the deeds. Although they carried out a lot of the deeds, these scenes of horror are acted in places far remote and out of sight of those who are enriched thereby, whose senses being usually exercised by present objects. So, and he's writing this to reach the hearts of those who aren't, what he said, hardened with the love of wealth. And it continues, it is frequently alleged in the excuse for this trade, so this excuse still goes on now, that the Negroes sold in our plantations are mostly persons who have been taken prisoners in those wars which arise amongst themselves from their mutual animosities, and that these prisoners would be sacrificed to the resentment of those who have taken them captive, if they were not purchased and brought away by the Europeans. It is also represented that the Negroes are generally a stupid, savage people whose situation in their own country is necessitous and unhappy, which has induced many to believe that the bringing of the Africans from their native land is to them rather a kindness than an injury. See, so that he calls it an excuse that they try to present to continue with the slave trade, saying that the Negroes sold in our plantations are mostly persons who have been taken prisoners in those wars which arise among themselves. It doesn't even matter. Like, and when we get further into this, he'll get into behind why those wars were taking place and what was going on after those wars and the capturing. And then this part about it is also represented that the Negroes are generally a stupid, savage people. He gets into that further into this document because he says, how would you expect a reasonable person to act if every time you come into their land, you're stealing people, you're taking people, you're looking for slaves. Every time you come into a land, you're harming a village, you're harming a people. How would you expect them to react at the mere sight of you? They're not a stupid, savage people. They're reacting the way that reasonable human beings react when they see danger. And he gets into that further into this document. Okay, to confute the false representations, the following extracts are proposed to the candid reader's consideration. They are taken from the writings of the principal officers, not only in the English, but also the French and the Dutch factories or settlements in Guinea, from some of whom have lived many years in those countries and have been eyewitnesses to those transactions, and whose station in the factories will not admit any doubt of the truth of what they relate, by which it will appear that the Negroes are generally sensible, humane, and sociable, and that their capacity is as good and as capable of improvement as that of the white people. So he's introducing the extracts that he's going to present and the purpose behind the extracts. And as to the common argument alleged in defense of the trade, that the slaves sold to the Europeans are captives taken in war, who would be destroyed by their conquerors if not thus purchased, it is without foundation, it being made clearly to appear from the forementioned testimonies that the wars and incursions made by the Negroes one upon another are mostly at the solicitation of the Europeans, who instigate them by every method, even the most iniquitous and cruel, to procure slaves to load their vessels, which they freely purchase without any regard to the precepts of the Gospels, the feelings of humanity, or the common dictates of reason and equity. So here he's talking about the divide and conquer method. Now, when I read this and when I'm thinking of the argument, the divide and conquer method was used. However, that still does not negate the fact that the Africans were selling other Africans. And this divide and conquer method was playing on greed, because they weren't forced to sell other Africans. Many of the Africans that they sold were not prisoners, they were just regular Africans, and that's talked about in this piece too. But they were selling them not just for guns, but they were selling them for weapons. They were selling them for rum and jewelry that they wanted to give to their wives and mistresses, and I think I've documented that. And these extracts are coming from people who lived in, they call it Guinea, but these are the ones who lived in Africa and who were involved in the areas where slave trade was taking place. So there was a divide and conquer. There were wars made by the Negroes upon one another at the solicitation of the Europeans. So the Europeans would ask for slaves and Africans would get them slaves. William Bothman, factor of the Dutch at Delmina, where he resided 16 years, relates that one of the former commanders hired an army of the Negroes of Phasphora, or Fafira, I'm not sure, and Casteria for a large sum of money to fight the Negroes of Comini, which occasioned a battle which was more bloody than the wars of the Negroes usually are, and that another commander gave at one time 500 pounds and at another time 800 pounds to two other Negro nations to induce them to take up arms against their country people. This is confirmed by Barbut. So, as far as research goes, what I would do if I wanted to look further into this was I would look up William Bothman, and then I would look up wherever he says this is confirmed by, and try to see the original document that he quoted here. But you can see here where he gets into some of the details of the divide and conquer. One of the commanders hired an army of Negroes to fight some other Negroes, which occasioned a battle more bloody than the wars than what usually happens. And I've read before that intertribal warfare between Africans before the Europeans came were not very large, and if a few died, if only a few people died in those wars, it was considered a bloody and sad war, because many of the wars they weren't out to kill each other, but with the Europeans it was more bloody than the wars the Negroes usually are. And then the commander gave at one time 500 pounds to one faction, and another time 800 pounds to another faction or nation to get them to fight against each other. So they gave them, they're like, here's some money for you to go fight them, and then they go to the other side and say, here's some money for you to go fight them. These nations fight each other, weaken each other, and then the Europeans take those who are supposedly captives, and then when a nation fights another nation, both nations are weakened, and then the Europeans will just come in and take whoever they wanted to take. And that was the plan, and that's what happened. And you can find that in the divide and conquer. European nations did that to each other as well. Like it's part of their art of war. Countries and nations that have civil wars have frequently found that soon after having a civil war, they're soon taken over by another nation, which is just sitting by watching. And in this excerpt that I just quoted, you can see they made a civil war by giving each nation money. That the discerning natives account it their greatest unhappiness that they were ever visited by the Europeans, that we Christians introduced the traffic of slaves, and that before our coming they lived in peace. But, say they, it is observable that wherever Christianity comes, there comes with it a sword, a gun, powder, and ball. See, this is for those who say like Christianity is the black or the white man's religion, and here he's addressing that and saying that as reasonable human beings, that is understandable why they would resist Christianity. It says that we Christians introduced the traffic of slaves, and that before our coming they lived in peace. But, say they, it is observable that wherever Christianity comes, there comes with it a sword, a gun, powder, and ball. So the natives accounted their greatest unhappiness that they were ever visited by the Europeans. So this resistance to religion that they wanted to uh, spread, and these accusations that Africans are natives, or I mean that Africans are savages. Well, he's saying like they're reacting like reasonable human beings because their greatest unhappiness is that they were ever visited by the Europeans. They, the Negroes, are generally speaking very good-natured, sociable, and obliging. I was not a little pleased, says he, he's quoting someone, with this my first reception. It convinced me that there ought to be a considerable abatement made in the accounts I had read and heard everywhere of the savage character of the Africans. I observed both in Negroes and Moors great humanity and sociableness, which gave me strong hopes that I should be very safe among them, and meet with the success I desired in my inquiries after the curiosities of the countries. So this is an account of someone who was actually in Africa and said that they were very good natured, sociable, and obliging. So he was like, what's going on with this accusation and accounts that I've read of them being savage? And I just find it interesting that he said both in Negroes and Moors. So he makes a distinction there, and I wonder what that distinction comes from. And I'm sure someone in the comment section will be very happy to let me know what that explanation is, and when they do, please provide me with somewhere where I can look it up. I'm just interested in that because I've always thought that the Moors were black Africans. Well, here it says Africans, and then he says Negroes and Moors. So that's in they're italicized. It's interesting. That's why I like to do this research and see things like that. For Captain Phillips declared them to be civil and courteous, and Snoke says he found them a civil, good-natured people, but that the late injury they had received from the English, who had carried off some of their people, had so exasperated them that it was to be feared some English people they had in their power would fall a sacrifice to their resentment. So there's, that's what it's saying. They're good, civil-natured people, but the injury that they had received from the English, who had carried off some of their people, had exasperated them. That it was to be feared some English people they had in their power would fall sacrifice to their resentment. So it's saying like we carried off some of their people, so the English people that they have may fall sacrifice to in consequence of what they were doing to the Africans. You kill some of our people, you take some of ours. Well, we're going to kill and take some of yours. Okay, this is just an account of the fertility of Africa and these African nations, and it also gives credence to the fact that the Africans weren't just a primitive people, and that the slaves that they brought to the U.S., they didn't teach them how to farm and how to work land. The slaves that they brought, or the Africans that they brought as slaves, they already had been farming for hundreds and hundreds of years, and this is the account of the country. Brew, in his account of the fertility of the country and industry of the natives, says, he was surprised to see the land so well cultivated, as he observed it to be in one of his journeys. Scarce a spot laid unimproved. The low grounds, divided by small canals, were all sowed with rice, the higher grounds planted with Indian corn and millet, and peas of different sorts, beef and mutton very cheap, as well as all other necessities of life. Bothman says the Indian and Guinea corn is here sown and reaped twice every year. The first harvest is in August, and the other the latter end of the year. Though but small, corn grows with little trouble, very speedily taking root, so that one or two men can manure and plow as much land as one plow can turn up in Holland. That two men can manure and plow as much land as one plow can turn up in Holland. See, so they had been farming in Africa way before the Europeans got there, and this is just an account of the land. Footpath is the only ground that is not covered with them. The Negroes leaving no place which is thought fertile or fertile, uncultivated, even within the hedges which enclose their villages. And the very next day, after they have reaped, they are sure to sow again. This fine country is now very much depopulated, which it is likely was owing to the incursions made upon them by their neighbors in order to get slaves to sell to the Europeans. For the same Bothman, speaking of the neighboring nation of Pope, says, they depend on plunder and the slave trade, in which they exceed some of their neighbors. So the slave trade led to the fall of Africa. Africa was prospering, and then the Europeans went in there with their guns and with their ideas and with their conquests, and they just started to destroy a nation. And the Africans fell for it. Francis Moore, Factor to the African Company in 1730, tells his reader that when the king of Barfali wants goods or brandy, he sends a messenger to the English governor at James Fort to desire he would send up a sloop with a cargo of goods, which, says the author, the governor never fails to do. Against the time the vessel arrives, the king plunders some of his enemies' towns, selling the people for such goods as he wants, which commonly is brandy or rum, gunpowder, ball, firearms, pistols, and cutlasses for his soldiers, and coral and silver for his wives, and it says, and mistresses later. I don't know if that's on the next. And mistresses. So, these are reasons why African nations were conquering each other to get slaves for their wives and mistresses. If he is at war with no neighboring king, he falls upon one of his own towns and makes bold to sell his own miserable subjects. He often goes with some of his troops by a town in the daytime and returns in the night and sets fire to 3 parts of it, placing guards at the 4th to seize the people that run out of the fire. Then ties their arms behind them and marches them to Sor or Roban, where he sells them. Bru, the French factor before mentioned, says that having received goods, he wrote to the king that if he had a sufficient number of slaves, he was ready to trade with them. This prince, says the author, as well as the other Negro monarchs, have always a sure way of supplying his deficiencies by selling their own subjects, for which they seldom want pretensions of some kind or other to justify their rapine. So, I mean, this speaks for itself. Like, so if they don't have, if they're not at, so a lot of these nations, if they weren't at war with someone, they would take their own, people, anything to keep that trade going on. Said the king that having received the goods wrote the king that, no, it said the Negro monarchs have always a sure way of supplying his deficiencies by selling their own subjects. Now, you can argue this and say, well, it's the conquerors or the victors who write this history, but this is, again, you need to read the whole document. And this abolitionist, he gives reasons why this is not a good excuse. But you need to face the truth. If you're going to make an argument against slavery, you need to put all the facts out in front of you. Otherwise, people aren't going to listen to you. So it was happening both ways. And a lot of people don't want to hear this, including myself when I first heard of it. When I was in school and I heard that the Africans were selling slaves, that the Africans were selling slaves, I didn't want to believe it. But it was happening, and people back then didn't look at race as they do now. This at this particular time right here, this was the beginning of white supremacy, but it was not yet a certain ideal, right? Like the Africans didn't look at each other as black people versus white people. They looked at each nation as a different nation. It wasn't a white black thing yet. But it was getting there, because he talks about, in this article, he talks about, well, we don't treat other European nations, like he talks about the French being the worst enemy of the English. He said, yeah, we don't treat our French prisoners the way that we treat these Africans. Why is it that we look at Africans as less than human beings? So that's like that's white supremacy going on right there. Thus, seeking pretenses to cover their crimes shows they are not quite void of shame and insensible that covetousness induces them to act a part inconsistent with their duty. But here they may plead the example and solicitation of the more knowing Europeans. The king had recourse to his method by seizing 300 of his own people and sent word to Brewery that he had the slaves ready to deliver for the goods. 300. And this was happening often. Like I said, this wasn't a small scale. This wasn't a few here, a few there. The king had recourse to his method by seizing 300 of his own people. So if he's going to take 300 of his own people, imagine how many people these kings and monarchs were settling when they conquered another nation. Which I said, selling these 300 men, healthy men, women, and children, because they only could sell the healthy ones. That led to the downfall of the entire continent. John Barbow says, the slaves sold by the Negroes are for the most part prisoners of war or taken in the incursions they make into their enemies' territories. Others are stolen away by their own countrymen. Abundance of little blacks of both sexes are stolen away by their neighbors when found abroad on the roads or in the woods or else in the cornfields at the time of year when their parents keep them there all day to scare away the devouring small birds. This reminds me of the scene in uh, the first Roots where the the black guy, the African, and the Europeans were just out there capturing other Africans. So they would pay blacks, they would pay them to stolen by their own countrymen. For they stay to make no choice. To see, this is talking about the slave. He didn't have no choice. And he further says that in battle they spare the enemies as much as possible, but it is only that they may have the more slaves, from which every persons of quality taken prisoners are not exempted, that the merchants bring down some years to that factory to the amount of 2,000 slaves, which they say are taken prisoners in war. See, 2,000 slaves. These they buy from the different princes who take them. Many of them come from a great way inland. Their way of bringing them is tying them by the neck with leather thongs about a yard distance from each other, having generally a bundle of corn or elephant's teeth on each of their heads, 30 or 40 in a string. So these African princes, like I said here, princes, they get all these, they go far to get these slaves. They tie them up, and not only do they have them as prisoners of war to sell them, they make them carry all kind of other bundles of corn and elephants' teeth and everything. They're trying to. This is all about economics. All of this is for money and greed on a large scale. 2,000 slaves, they say, are taken prisoners of war. Crimes, in order to have the benefit of selling the criminal, so that not only great crimes but even trifling ones are at present punished with slavery. Yeah, this is another thing, another idea just to pile up on it. In order to sell slaves, they would call you a criminal. They made laws so that for the most trifling crimes, they would you would be punished with selling you into slavery. That sounds like what goes on today. That they're trying to. I mean, it's just like for something small, you get put in prison, like non-violent offenses or like little small drug offenses. They put you in jail, and we know that by the 13th Amendment that as a criminal you can be put into slavery. So read the 13th Amendment. Bothman says that being in the kingdom of Pope who depend on plunder and the slave trades in which they exceed some of their neighbors, because being endued with a much larger share of courage, they rob more successfully. They assured him that if they would have patience for 3 days, they would be able to deliver him 100 or 200 slaves, and that their incursions succeeded so well they returned with about 200 slaves. That the inhabitants of Arda were so diligent in the slave trade that they were able to deliver 1,000 slaves every month, and that if there happened to be no stocks of slaves when the vessels arrived, they would sometimes send their commodities 200 miles deep in the country. A later author says they have now carried the trade 500 miles farther, going now 700 miles back into the country where markets of men were kept in. So this is large scale trade. 1,000 slaves every month, going 200, 500, 700 miles deep, searching for stocks of men, markets of men. That's what it says. Sold by the victors as their booty. When these slaves come to Theta, they are put in prison altogether, and when, says he, we treat concerning having baying them, they are all brought out together by a large plain whereby our surgeons they are thoroughly examined, and that naked they both men and women without the least distinction or modesty. Those which are approved as good are set on one side. In the meanwhile a burning iron, with the arms or name of the companies, lies in the fire with which ours are marked on the breast. So these slaves are stripped naked, thoroughly examined. The good ones are set on one side and marked with the branding on the breast. So they're branding. And I was reading in a book earlier today that it was a fiction book, but it was about the Underground Railroad. It was about a slave who was sold time and time and time and time again, and each time she was sold, she was branded again and again and again by each master. So they were branding them like cattle. And you know that hurts. And like our criminals, fed them like our criminals on bread and water, so that to save charges we send them on board of our ships with the very first opportunity, before which their masters strip them all they have on their backs, so that they come on board stark naked, as well women as men, stark naked. They're put on these slave ships, in which condition they are obliged to continue, if the master of the ships is not so charitable, which he commonly is, as to bestow something on them to cover their nakedness. 600 or 700 are sometimes put on board a vessel, where they lie as close together as possible for them to be crowded. I doubt not, says the same author, but this trade seems very barbarous to you, but since it is followed by near necessity, it must go on. What necessity does the author mean? No other necessity appears but that arising from the desire of amassing riches, a necessity laid on worldly men by their hard taskmaster, the devil. Many more examples might be given to show the arbitrary and tyrannic oppression with which this trade is carried on, and the devastation and bloodshed it occasions in those unhappy people's country. But I trust this is sufficient to. So Yeah, stark naked. They're put on a slave ship, close together, crowded together, and then their excuses, well, it's a necessity that we put them close together. And he says, what's the necessity? To amass riches for the hard taskmaster, the devil. So he's saying that, like, this is the devil's work. It is the slavery which is permitted in America that has hindered it from becoming so soon populous as it would have otherwise have done. Let the Negroes free, and in a few generations this vast and fertile continent would be crowded with inhabitants, learning arts, and everything would flourish among them. Instead of being inhabited by wild beasts and by savages, it would be peopled by philosophers and men. So he's saying here, like, as free men in America would flourish. And I believe that now. If they stop making the prison system, if they would stop taking 13% of the population and filling up the prison system by 40% and 50% of black people, and give them and stop the oppression which is going on in America, the country would flourish. Like he says here, let the Negroes free, and in a few generations, this vast and fertile continent would be crowded with inhabitants. Learning, arts, and everything would flourish among them. It would be peopled by philosophers and by men. But instead of that, they continued with the slavery for a few more hundred years. Then, after they, quote, freed the slaves, they went into the Reconstruction, which was worse than slavery for many, many years. And then after that, they had Jim Crow. And then after that, segregation. Black people have only been, if you want to call this free, it's only been like in the last 40 years. Because, like, Martin Luther King was fighting for freedom, and he died in 68. So, and he wasn't finished. And this guy, Anthony Benazet, said, let him free, and they could benefit the nation. He said that slavery was holding it is the slavery which is permitted in America that has hindered it from becoming so soon populous as it would otherwise have done. George Wallace, a gentleman of the law, in a book wrote by him. So I showing this to, like, if you were going to do research, you find the original. And speaking of the slavery of the Negroes in our colonies, he says, extracts from a manuscript entitled, look how he wrote entitled, Two Dialogues on the Man Trade, printed in London in the year 1760. Okay, the African blacks are as properly and truly men as the European whites. They are both of the same species and are originally descended from the same parents. They have the same rational powers as we have. They are free moral agents as we are, and many of them have as good natural genius, as good and as brave a spirit as any of those to whom they are made slaves. So this argument that white people actually believed the Negroes to be inferior, I'm saying Negroes because they keep referring to them, but when they say that white people actually believed that black people were inferior to them, that's bullcrap. They know that Africans and blacks are men and women with the same feelings, same aspirations, and the same, quote, beginnings as they. But it even said earlier in this piece that the land was more fertile in Africa. The conditions weren't as harsh. He hath, okay, and this is going back to the religion. He hath given this earth in common to the children of men. God gave to man dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Genesis 1:26. But not to any man over another, nor can one man on any supposition whatsoever become the property or part of the goods or estate of another. See, here he says, nor can one man on any supposition whatever. So it doesn't matter who's selling who's capturing who. There's no reason, there's no supposition whatever that you can support through the Bible that one man become the property of another man. It doesn't say that in the Bible. So you can't use the Bible to support slavery. Because it said man is master of the fish, the fowl in the air, cattle, and creeping thing on the earth, not other men. Man stealers were, by the law of Moses, punished with death. He that stealeth a man, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Exodus 21:16. In the New Testament, 1 Timothy 1:10, man stealers are reckoned amongst the very worst of men. Can anything be more cruel and barbarous than to seize upon human creatures? So the Bible clearly denounces slavery. So don't let anybody use the Bible to support slavery, and don't think that the Bible was used by Christians, but the Bible is not a white man's religion. You need to get the Bible and look at it yourself before you start condemning people for following what the Bible says, because the Bible denounces all these treacherous things that man does to one another. You can be what religion you want to, but before you just go off accusing people of blindly following, make sure you're not blindly making accusations based on a book that you have not read. Guinea merchants, I think one may venture to affirm that at least a tenth part of them die on the voyage. He's talking about the middle passage here and death. Like he condemns death. The merchants are certainly chargeable with taking away the lives as many of those poor creatures as come by their death by being so confined and treated, and are guilty of murder. For to take away a man's life unjustly is murder, whether it be done in 2 or 3 minutes or 2 or 3 months, that makes no difference. So he's talking about the middle passage. He believes that all of the Europeans and Africans who captured the Africans and put them in the middle passage, if any of those slaves died, all of them should be charged by murder. He said it doesn't matter if it's 2 or 3 minutes or 2 or 3 months, because the middle passage was months and months. It makes no difference. Murder is murder. Life is guilty of murder. by the accounts given in the second volume of the Complete System of Geography. The number of Negroes brought away by the English in the year 1725 appeared to be about 50,000. We will suppose that the number of Negroes purchased by our Guinea merchants one year with another are no more than 35,000. See, we're talking about the thousands, 50,000, 35,000. Now, in the account given by that author of the Negroes in our plantations, it is said that in the island of Jamaica, almost half of the new imported Negroes die in the seasoning, and that in Barbados it is reckoned that a fourth part die in seasoning. And according to the FAME account, there are twice as many imported into these two islands as into all other islands in the West Indies and all our colonies in North America. As a moderate computation, therefore, it may be reckoned that all those who are purchased by our African merchants in a year, 12,000 die upon the voyage and the seasoning. So 12,000 a year. So he's just giving an account of how wrong this trade was. And we know, even in school, they talked about how many. This is giving numbers, but the amount of people who died during the Middle Passage was incalculable. Sir Hans Sloane, in his History of Jamaica, says, now when you're reading this, he's giving names and titles, so you can look these up. You can look them up to justify or not justify what you want to believe or not believe. Sir Hans Sloane, in his History of Jamaica, says that a rebellious Negro, or he that twice strikes a white man, is condemned to the flames, being chained flat on his belly at the place of execution, and his arms and legs extended. Fire is then set to his feet, and he is burnt gradually up to his head. They starve others to death with a loaf hanging before their mouths, so that some gnaw the very flesh off their own shoulders and expire with all the frightful agonies, expressing the most horrid tortures. For crimes of a less nature they are geld the offender and chop off half of his foot with an axe. For negligence only they whip him till his back is raw, and then scatter pepper and salt on his wounds to heighten the smart. And some planters would drop melted wax on their skins, which puts them into intolerable pain. Now, must not human nature and whose people be changed to the devilish, and who can put these creatures to such torments? See, if earlier in this book you said that, the victors write the history, it seems that he's being pretty sincere in his writings. Now, he's taking extracts from different authors, but in his choice, he's very serious about fighting slavery. He just wants to show how barbarous the slave trade was, and he was an abolitionist, which he wanted to abolish this and make end slavery. Okay, that the same author says that the matters of the Negroes are obliged to treat them very severely, not only because of the stubborn, treacherous temper, which is so peculiar to all of their complexion and country, but because there are 3 times the number of whites in this inland, and have made frequent attempts to get the mastery, that is their liberty, or to deliver out of the miserable slavery they are in. So this is an argument about why they're oppressing the blacks. And then he says, but how come they are to be 3 times the number of whites in this island? Is it not owing to the white inhabitants to their purchasing them and keeping them in bondage? How weak then is this excuse? That was funny because that's how we talk today. Like he didn't even want to, he didn't even want to acknowledge an argument there. He said, how weak is that excuse? You say that we treat them this way. Example of whites for their excuse, whereas in Barbados, the same author says, and talks about why they treat blacks and oppress them is because they outnumber the whites. And he says, but who brought them there? Is it not owing to the white inhabitants to their purchasing them and keeping them in bondage? How weak then is this excuse? Where is the sense? He says, where is the sense? So there you have, a short account. And look up Anthony Benezet because he has more writings and he has influenced other abolitionists to have writings, and you can actually see that by Googling his name, and you can get the titles of the other writings and do your search to find them. But this was just, this is a pretty long video, but this is just one of the some of the research. So thanks for watching it. Jason Williams, Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.